Hello, everyone. This is Elle speaking. Welcome back to our Million Match Teach-In series. This is our second teach-in. We're going to do an open Q&A today. And Audrey, I saw an expression on your face. Is there something wrong tech-wise?
No, I just had a bite of a spicy burrito and my lips are foaming. So that's
Just checking. Good luck with your lips there. And I'll do a visual description for myself and then hand it off to Audrey. And then we'll share some slides with you all um, just to provide some basic background for folks just tuning in or folks coming back. And then it's a open free for all questions and we'll get through as much as we can. So I'm Elle, pronouns are they, them. I am a thin, white, very tall hype. I have kind of fluffy, short brown hair right now, wearing over-the-ear headphones, tinted glasses, a very bright silver chain with a iridescent stone on it, a floral iridescent vest over a black t-shirt, and in my background, you can see a half orange wall, half white wall, and my cane leaning against a counter. Audrey, want to introduce yourself?
sure. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here today. My name is Audrey. I use she, her pronouns, and I am an average height, thin white person. I've got half blonde, half brown hair, really pulled back. It's wet, so it looks like slicked. Um, I'm wearing a white t-shirt and I'm in front of a white wall with a kind of third of a blue painting behind me and then a door that is open on the other side. Um, and that's it, right? There was nothing else you said that I also need to mirror, right? Okay, great.
I think you got it. Great. All right, I'm going to share my screen and kind of introduce this campaign for a little bit of background, talk through some accessibility stuff. So I'm going to share my screen. Oh, and one more thing before I share my screen. If anyone needs any access support or is having trouble with tech, just message Roy, who's labeled Roy Tech, and they should be able to help you out. All right, sharing screen. Can folks see what I'm seeing?
Yes, I am.
Beautiful. So again, we're here for our second Million Match teach-in. This is a part of a 6-month long series where we're going to go through a lot of educational stuff and also talk about our clinic, Hyp+Care. So right now we're looking at a beautiful image of a kind of scene with floral patterns and hills. We've got a blue to pink gradient in the background, a kind of white rainbow sweeping over the top with the title Million Match Teach-Ins for Hyp+Care. The Hyp+Care logo is a pill, and then it says December 2024 through May 2025. That's the 6-month period this teach-in series is taking place in. We've got some green hills across the bottom with trees growing out of them made up of the shape of the Hyp+Care pill and our logo at the bottom, a big goopy pink H and the words Hyp+Access. All right. So, oh no, it says the wrong thing. Um, but we're here for our second Million Match teach-in. The title is Hype Open Q&A, not What is Hype? And the date is January 30th, 2025. Could you read through accessibility, Audrey?
Sure. So auto captions are on. If you have not turned them on yet and you would like to, on the bottom bar of the Zoom screen, there's a 3 dots in a circle button. It also says more if you can read their gray font. And if you click there, you should be able to turn captions on. Sometimes there will be a CC button at the bottom of your screen. So it could be a 3 dots in a circle, could be a CC button. You'll have to find out. We're going to try and speak slowly. And if we're going too fast, we are super open to folks reminding us to slow down, and we appreciate the reminders. That could be a reminder in the chat. That could be verbally spoken aloud. We have no problem with you interrupting us for that. So do it if you want to. We're going to be reading as much of the chat as possible aloud. And we're only going to be reading messages sent to all participants. So if you send a private message to Roy or Elle or myself or anyone else in the Zoom room, that will not be read aloud. We're going to visually describe ourselves, which we did earlier, and the images we look at on these slides. And if you need additional live access support, you can message Roy, who is titled Roy-Tech on their name. It's called the label. I don't know. And if the chat is not accessible to you and you need additional access support, please just interrupt us if you feel comfortable. Totally good to, reorganize at that moment. After the end of this experience, this session we're having, we're going to upload a captioned recording that will be properly captioned, so we won't be relying on auto caption to interpret what we're saying. And that will be ongoing on YouTube for free access. We also have a bunch of sources that we may be referencing, and those are available on a corresponding event page on our website. Yeah. And you can go to the next slide, Elle, if you'd like to.
Sure. So just a little agenda for today. We're already through some of this. We're going to talk just a little bit of background about Hyp, which a lot of you here live today are probably familiar with, but a lot of you listening to this on YouTube may not be. And then we're going to talk about what we need from community and what we're working towards for the rapid launch of Hyp+Care. And then we'll get into the Q&A. And we'll probably end early since we don't have a big presentation to get through with y'all. But if we are really getting going, we'll take a little break towards the end of our planned hour-and-a-half time and resume. All right. So a little bit about us. For those who may not know, we are a community-based nonprofit org transitioning into providing direct clinical and alternative care services. Our expertise is in supporting folks with connective tissue variance and overlapping conditions with a cross-disability solidarity framework. And since our official launch in 2020, the demand for our services has increased probably much over 850%. And our work, this shows, really meets a vital growing need for informed resources and accessible direct care. And you can learn more about everything we do at hyp-access.org, hyp-access.org. Next slide. And as a general reminder for the kind of constellation of conditions and experiences that we focus on, what is Hyp? This was the focus of our first teach-in last month. It is connective tissue variance. It is multi-system. It is multi-symptom. It is the whole body. It's so many different experiences. It is not as simple as medicine and many other systems have made it out to be.
And this is Audrey speaking. If you'd like to watch our first teach-in, it is uploaded on YouTube now and available for viewing at your leisure.
Indeed. Okay. Want to take this one?
Sure. So we started out as a care access consulting and advocacy organization for patients and families. And from there, we decided we can't get people the care that they need. So we're going to try and run it. And so now we're launching our first medical and alternative direct care program. It's called Hyp+Care. It's going to be in New York City, in Manhattan. And if all the timelines line up the way we are hoping for them to, we will be opening our first location in the fall of this year. We also provide ongoing peer and practitioner training in our accessible touch therapy called HAPT, which stands for Hypermobile Accessible Proprioceptive Therapy, and training for connective tissue literacy and understanding how to approach these experiences in a bodywork setting. That's actually how we really initially got into a lot of this work, was through bodywork being inaccessible for hypes and other folks. We track medical science, care, and related systems in terms of, the systems we all live under that impact community well-being. So we just actually released a really large report on employment and healthcare that was funded by Tides, and we talk about ways that employers should really be considering providing benefits, and especially for folks who require high healthcare usage. We provide public education on disability and connective tissue variance really across the board. We try and provide as many free resources for community as possible. Though I will say our website is kind of a black hole. There's really a lot of information. So if you have trouble finding something or you're looking for something, you can always shoot us an email at info@hyp-access.org and we will link it. We do accessibility consulting for organizations, primarily in New York State. And we, at one point, taught hypermobile accessible dance improvisation classes, but that was some time ago. All of our services are sliding scale and free if you need, and we're really narrowing in on providing direct care for folks, which I think leads us to the next slide, which is really why we're here today. So we have designed a model within current insurance and policy frameworks that is really an attempt at addressing as many systemic problems as possible within the current medical model to provide care services that are more affordable, more accessible, integrated, staff communicate with each other. There are accountability processes, et cetera. And our program is called Hyp+Care. It's really by and for people living with connective tissue related disorders or conditions and overlapping experiences as well, including long COVID. We have a very broad approach to categorizing a lot of experiences that are talked about as really different. We see a lot of the connections between them rather than the differences, and really want to utilize that opportunity to reconsider how we approach things within the current medical model. So diagnostics to us is more of a medical coding and care access framework than it is a true description of a complex experience. Anyway, I'm probably going a little too much into this, but to give folks kind of a broader sense of where we're coming from, we aren't, only supporting folks with hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. There's way more there. And we can answer questions about all of this. Yeah, anyway, we can go to the next slide. I'm sorry. So we like to pose this question: what if there was a place you could go that provided treatments based on symptom experiences instead of narrow diagnostic criteria? What if there were robust care options available for every manifestation of the Hyp constellation all in one place, and care teams worked as teams? Wouldn't that be nice? So that's really what we're going for. It's gonna, take some time to really build the structure we're wanting. And I think we're gonna have a really good start in the fall, and we're really excited about it. And we're moving very quickly, which is kind of wild. So yeah, we hope to kind of shake things up and hopefully provide options really centered around Medicaid access. So when we talk about medical access, we're centering it on Medicaid access, which means we take a lot of insurance types, right? But we're really thinking about Medicaid access and the administrative burdens that come with that and taking that off of the patient, et cetera. Okay, we can go to the next slide.
I will go to the next slide after I describe that there are some flower balls made up of fill shapes floating across kind of a pink gradient on this screen. And then I'll go to the next slide, in which we have our campaign information. There's a big flower ball made up of pills in the middle. And this campaign is the Million Match for Hyp+Care campaign. An anonymous angel donor is matching our first million raised, which will enable us to launch this clinic. So it says on the top left, help Hyp+Access match 1 million by May 2025. This is a 6-month campaign leading up till then. And there is a QR code on the bottom right if folks need to scan. We really appreciate any amount of support and also just spreading the word about what we do, because a lot of people do not know, and we approach these conditions really differently than medicine, than other organizations, than society. And we need to get care to folks now. And I think that Roy can also drop the campaign link directly in the chat if they haven't already.
You did.
Great. Anything you want to add, Audrey?
Well, let's go to the next slide where we talk about what folks, what we mean. Well, this one, I guess, first, and then we'll go to the next one. We're looking for money, and it may not be the everyday Joe that is able to provide the kind of support, but ultimately we find the money people through community and connections. The amount of funding we end up raising is going to determine how we're able to roll out our care delivery system and how many people we can train pretty immediately to increase values aligned capacities, because most clinicians don't have this experience, and we have some really great clinical directors who are going to be training folks. We have a built-in training program in our care delivery model. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So when we talk about fundraising, we're not asking for mutual aid funds. We ask that folks save those for mutual aid. We're looking for minimum required distributions from IRAs, 401ks, different kinds of financial accounts that people with wealth tend to have. They tend to have required minimum distributions for tax purposes, and that's a great way to redistribute money into nonprofits, really. We're looking for funds from donor-advised funds, folks who have wealth strategies that include tax deductions. We also take stock. So if folks want to offload some stock that is not financially solvent, totally accept it. Grants from family foundations, family legacy funds, funds for charities or donations. So those are the kind of funds we're looking for. And we'll go to the next slide to talk about how we find those people. Any amount donation is helpful. Recurring donations are also matched. But really the way that we get those values aligned donors and people who can really get us to that next level are through asking people in your community if you know someone who knows someone who might be interested. Talk about why our work matters to you. You could be a part of our fundraising team. You can sign up for our clinic waitlist. Isn't there another slide that talks about, there's like one slide I'm thinking of, and I'm not sure if I left it in here. Is there a next slide, Elle? Sorry.
Let's find out. Just that.
Okay, well, I didn't put it in, but we are always looking for people with a variety of kinds of expertise, people who are in leadership roles, who have connections, people who are in, have experience on boards, in advisory roles. So really, lots of connections are helpful. I'll stop there because I'm kind of rambling now, but yeah,
Okay.
anything is appreciated.
It is. And there are so many ways to help other than money, and community has been the reason we've gotten this far. and the reason that we've been connected to every piece of support we've received. So thank you all so much. And this is a graphic again of those pill flowers rolling across the screen and a repeat of the QR code. But I'm going to stop my share now so you can ask us all your burning questions. And I'll check the chat as well, if there's anything going on. Thanks, Roy, for dropping those links. And yeah, now we're going to transition to completely open Q&A time. You can unmute to ask questions. You can drop questions in the chat and we will read them aloud. Those are your options, I think. And we're really open to answering anything, whether it's, you know, the most basic questions about what hypermobility is, why we don't use the term hypermobility so much anymore, what connective tissue is, how all these conditions overlap, how you get care for them. So we'll see if anyone wants to start us off. Take your time.
Well, I would like to say hi and thank you guys for what you're doing. Um, I first came across your work through Gil Headley, I guess, through his group. And my daughter had Down syndrome, and so she has hypermobility, especially in her legs. So that's a big part of my interest. I also work with some midwives, and we recently had a client that had Ehlers Daniels, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but and that also brought a lot of interest to me, just to learn more about it and understand that through a midwifery perspective. And I guess thirdly, the thing that catches my interest is this long COVID concept. I have a lot of curiosity about that. I feel like my father might be suffering some from that. He thinks he's just old, but I think there's something else going on, and he started having seizures and some different stuff. So everything you're doing just stimulates a lot of curiosity for me. Yeah, so thank you.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah, and actually the connection with Downs is a really interesting piece that we do not see other folks talking about very much, but is certainly part of this connective tissue constellation. And probably the diagnosis those folks in the hospital were talking about was Ehlers-Danlos, but it could have been Loeys-Dietz. Those are both pretty specialty diagnoses for what are considered genetic connective tissue issues.
Mm-hmm.
And long COVID. Is there anything more you want to say about long COVID, Audrey? It's just becoming more and more of a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is viral infection impacts tissues, even if it's not a super obvious, immediate, acute threat. And COVID in particular has many damaging effects. And we view a lot of those as coming from and being really related to connective tissue variants that is either happening or worsening because of viral infection and the way that that activates mast cells and, kind of ends up manifesting similar and a lot of the same diagnostic categories that Hypes experience. So of course, viral infection can also worsen other things.
Conditions. Mm-hmm.
But we view connective tissue variance as a combination of nature and nurture, and it could kind of be a variety of reasons, whether there is some genetic predisposition, quote unquote, but maybe there's the reality that folks can just develop this over time based on environmental exposure. So, anyway, it's a whole pot of fun, but long COVID research really has given us a lot of insight into the Hyp experience. I think
Mm-hmm.
there is so much more funding for it. And so, there's kind of a bi-directional possible conversation that really could be happening that I think, people like to categorize so separately rather than maybe noticing the similarities in experiences. So hopefully one day that becomes more of a larger conversation.
Larger, yeah. And that's what I'm seeing is any, he has what, like, there's a bunch of grandkids, 7 or something, and every time one of them gets sick, he's exposed to some kind of load, viral load, then he flares up with these things, and so I'm seeing that relationship, and I feel like there's something in it, but I don't really understand it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's unfortunately probably a lot of mechanisms combined
Mm-hmm.
that, decide that there's one in every situation. And I think with COVID and post-viral or viral triggered illnesses generally, it's like there's a lot going on,
A lot, yeah.
Um, and depending on the person, obviously that will shift the exact pattern. But yeah, and there's definitely care that people can access. It's just not widespread enough. Um, you know, I think complex problems are not what medicine wants to deal with.
Right.
So there's kind of a resistance to it internally in a variety of ways, unfortunately. I don't know if we're like answering a question or really just blabbing on. So
Well, it's very good. Cool.
Do you have any follow-up question there, Uriel?
I just started your guys' course. Was it the ground? What was uh, one of your courses? Just to basic to get some, um, oversight. And I haven't really made much progress. I've gotten a little ways through it, but I'm looking forward to learning more about it. I feel like there's something you had mentioned on the Gil Headley conversation, about the spine, because my daughter's mobility with her legs, it's always been a thing for me of like, some days she's really strong and she can do things. And then other days, all of a sudden, she's not, and it's been hard for me to figure out what it is that's causing that. And that was very helpful when you guys mentioned about this, that it could be something in her spine that's out where she's not saying, oh, my back hurts. She's saying, oh, my leg isn't working, properly. So, yeah, there's, I guess, anything on, I see that there's a lot more for me to learn in the class. So I don't really want to waste everybody's time asking too many questions before I, get through what you've already offered. But thank you.
Thank you. And I dropped a link to our online educational programs in the chat. We have a few options for kind of learning about the basics of hype and connective tissue, learning about some really kind of horrifying things when it comes to neurology and kind of sociological history. And then I think the training that Uriel, you were referencing, providing all of that content as well as training in our proprioceptive therapy HAPT.
Yeah.
Great. And while any other folks stew on their questions, I also want to add on the note of long COVID that escalation and how it has made things so much worse for so many people was a really strong motivator for us deciding that Hyp+Care is what needed to happen. And we needed to figure out a way to get people the direct care we'd only been advocating for beforehand. A question from Amy D that I'm going to read aloud. Do you have any suggested resources / scientific papers that can be included to support a disability claim appeal that help demonstrate the reality and complexity of these conditions? I'm especially interested in resources for G-HSD, which is a generalized category for hypermobility spectrum disorder, and POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, and how these conditions are misunderstood by most doctors, such as the doctors relied upon by insurance companies for disability claims. Any other guidance on how to best approach the long-term disability appeals process would be appreciated. This is for a private employer-based insurance claim appeal. Thank you. That is a complex question and a really difficult process to go through. So power to you, Amy. And I guess there's a short and long answer to this. Audrey, were you about to say something?
Well, I was just going to say that there have been, and if only my brain worked like a computer file system, but there's some papers that have come out more recently talking about how the experience of POTS is similar to the severity of congestive heart failure and the levels of disability that can come with it. I think those papers are some of the more directly speaking to how disabling POTS can be, and frames it in a way that maybe an insurance person, I don't really know what to call them, would be able to understand a little bit better what we're talking about when we're talking about disabling impacts and what that really feels like. It's hard because well, and now I'm maybe hyper focusing on POTS too much, but people get a little over focused on the type of POTS. And so a lot of like the American Heart Association summaries of dysautonomia are very trying to categorize things in ways that they actually don't really show up in people, like, oh, there's these different kinds of dysautonomia and this is the way you treat each one and they show up separately and things like that. But the more recent American, or maybe it was the American Cardiology Association, one of the more recent statement papers that came out as a summary was definitely better than the ones in the past, acknowledging that they are impactful. I don't know if case studies that are more severe would potentially be more supportive, but maybe finding case studies that mirror parts of your experience, just to document that those experiences relate to that diagnosis. I don't want to take up the whole airtime.
Yeah. There are some slightly older, but still relatively recent pieces of research discussing how bad physician awareness is and how bad neglect is of some of these conditions. So those may be useful things. And I also want to add that I'm making a couple notes on what we're saying right now, and we'll try to gather those sources and put them up on the live source page so they'll be available after the event. So there's some things talking about kind of general neglect, and there's got to be some hypermobility and pain impact things. I think sometimes it gets a little tricky when the diagnosis is HSD because much of the research has been done for the kind of more genetically considered hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And sometimes there's not quite enough indicating the severity of connective tissue variance that does not fit that incredibly narrow criteria. Yeah.
I also wonder if All Brains Belong has some more doctor-geared resources that connect all of these things, kind of like cheat sheets. I know that they're working on a lot of public materials for diagnostics and treatment and just getting that information out and how everything is really connected. So that actually may be also a resource to look into that may already be organized in a way that would be more digestible for a doctor at an insurance company. And Amy said in the chat, yes, absolutely agree on the HSD/strict criteria issue. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. Ah, yes, I love All Brains Belong. Good idea to look at their doctor resources. Thank you both. Yes. Sure. Yeah. Long-term disability appeals with insurance companies. Oof. Yeah, I'm sorry that you're dealing with that.
Yeah. And I'm going to drop a link to All Brains Belong for anyone who hasn't checked out that organization in the chat.
Yeah. And Molly put something in the chat. The question is, do you have any advice on how to work with doctors who separate issues or fail to recognize the overlap between symptoms? I realize that this is a huge problem. Don't let them decide what is what. Like, if you want access to a certain kind of care through a certain kind of physician, this is so annoying, right? Organize and present your symptoms that make them understand it, like through Google, in the sense of like, let's say I have CCI triggered dysautonomia. Maybe one way I notice that is I lift my arm up and then I get dizzy. Or I'm brushing my hair and then I start to get really dizzy, or my heart rate really spikes or something like that, or I'm chewing and that happens. I need to see a neurologist and a cardiologist simultaneously. I'm not going to tell them that it is CCI triggered dysautonomia, because that concept is not, that's too far for them. Like, so I'm going to take the symptom sets that most spoon feed them describe the category I'm trying to fall into to get the care that I want. And this sounds simpler than it is, for sure. And then maybe I know that my dizziness and dysautonomia symptoms coming from moving my upper body or trying to stabilize my head and my neck. You know, me internally, I understand how that relates, but you can just repeat the symptom sets to both the neurologist and the cardiologist, because in their mind, all of those symptoms relate to that one thing, even if you know the direction or the order of which things happen. So it's almost like trying to be a mirror and like spoon feeding them the information. But it's a lot easier to do that when you know what you are seeking and that person maybe does that thing or potentially is more receptive. I'm bringing up a really specific kind of situation, but I would not let them stew on it too much. Although if it's something like ligament laxity causing GI problems and potentially like vascular compression, then you have to do that sorting work for them because it's not going to, we don't know many folks who have that kind of critical thinking capacity in a medical setting. So unfortunately, yeah. Elle, do you want to add anything to?
Yeah, I'll add that, I mean, it depends on the situation very greatly. But if it happens to be a physician like a PCP who seems open to learning, maybe there are resources you could provide them to start understanding things as more interconnected. Could forward them to our website. All Brains Belong also has great resources for physicians. But in general, when it comes to actual specialists, it's like you really need to be the doctor and not necessarily in, having that degree or that full knowledge base, but in managing the care and tailoring what symptoms you bring to who, like Audrey said, usually ends up being a lot more effective than, for example, coming to one type of specialist with your entire symptom list.
And yeah, like it's unfortunate how much complexity you kind of have to take away. And even if I know in my soul that my dysautonomia behaves slightly differently than what is frequently thought about as that thing, like focusing on those differences or even talking about it in the way that you experience it can be counterproductive to actually getting the resources and the access because they literally think it's that list that they're just going through. And if you're not pre-syncope, you don't have it. So even like let's say for dysautonomia, you got the heart rate stuff, you got the blood pressure stuff. Of course, it's not really going to be caught in a medical setting unless you're able to catch it in a medical setting. Some people can, some people can't. Let's say there's GI things that happen too, and maybe you get dizzy, but maybe you get really nauseous, and maybe you don't really fully go even into pre-syncope, but your heart rate is increasing in a way where you do need to stop what you're doing, or your symptoms that are present are still really bad. And let's say in life you've passed out fully twice, which is totally normal to have dysautonomia and only fully pass out a few times, or even not ever fully pass out. But let's say it's not even recent. Still bring that to them and kind of lead with that because that's their understanding, their really limited understanding of how this presents. And so it's kind of like you have to take your puzzle of symptoms and signs and then reorganize it so that it's like they're reading the Google page or the Johns Hopkins page about how it's described. Because this is absurd, but
that's probably what they're doing.
that is what they're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll add one more thing, which is on occasion, there are situations in which the connection between symptoms absolutely are within the purview of that specialist, and they really need to be paying attention to it. And if they're refusing to run a test because they're saying that this symptom couldn't possibly be real or couldn't be connected to this or that, then it's time for a new doctor. Generally.
And sometimes going to a doctor that already has that in their view, because I think, like a lot of doctors that work with special needs children are already familiar with some of those symptoms, whereas somebody who isn't showing themselves as being any different than anyone else on the outside, might not go to that doctor that specializes with some of those symptoms. So I'm just throwing that out there as like a thing.
Yeah. And sometimes those doctors also work within a framework of how those symptoms present only in one way or in a subset of the population too. So I think sometimes it can be a double-edged sword with those who know too, because sometimes they'll, you might be slightly different, and then that's not what they are used to treating, or, you're not severe enough or whatever. Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know if you can ever get doctors to like conference call with each other. So if it's a situation where you need them to talk to each other, that's a hard one. Um, but yeah, hopefully that kind of answered your question, Molly. Sorry. Vigilant. Molly says yes, thank you. Okay, cool. Um, yeah. Any other questions or thoughts or reflections or contributions like Uriel was doing?
So I would be curious to know, like, what your clinic, what is its dream? Where is it going to be? Do you have a physical location starting up yet? And you were saying in there that you are going to be working with insurance companies
Mhm.
through the clinic. And so in order to do that, will you guys be able to diagnose
Mhm.
conditions? I guess,
I mean, not myself, although, we do oversee the clinical side. Um, so having a nonprofit medical center actually provides the possibility for oversight that is not MD driven, which is a part of why we stayed. We just transitioned our organization into a medical providing organization rather than incorporated a different organization. So we're in New York State. New York is the most highly regulated state for medical care. So the process to open something totally new is a beast. Excuse me, I'm burping. Um, and the clinic, we're this close to signing all the paperwork. Um, but we'll have a physical location in Manhattan. I'm not going to say the location until the paperwork is signed. We were supposed to have it signed a month or so ago, but landlords, you know what I mean? Um, and we're actually doing a build of a floor. So we're building out a whole floor in Manhattan, and we'll be starting out with um, non-interventional cardiology, which just means like cardiology specialty, but there's no like we're not putting stents in, we're not doing procedures like that. Um, we'll have infusion services, so we'll have 7 bays for infusion. We'll have primary care, and we'll also have pain management. And pain management will also include osteopathy and medical acupuncture. So our goal is to launch with a focus on Medicaid access. Although the way the state works is you actually can't enroll in Medicaid until we get our official certificate to operate. So there is going to be like a 2 or 3 month delay for when we can actually take our Medicaid patients, which is really frustrating and is just something we can't actually get around in New York State. Didn't used to be this way, but it's gotten this way in the last few years. So we plan on having a 33% of commercial Medicare and Medicaid uh, uh, patients, basically. So in New York, that means enrolling in not just Medicaid, but all of the Medicaid managed care plans, obviously Medicare, and then commercial and other state-specific plans that serve, the city and the rest of the state. So it'll be a diagnostic and treatment center, which means we have the ability to diagnose and treat. We'll be providing some of those treatments through infusions. Some will be manual, therapy, and some will be medication-based. One of the central components of the model is actually peer care managers. So we're transitioning our care access advocacy and consulting program into like a insurance covered care manager that people are assigned that then really is the person who is like your quarterback, I don't know, or whatever kind of metaphor, like the person who's going to be advocating for you, doing appointments for you, making sure the clinicians are talking to each other, calling you after your infusion and being like, hey, how did that go? Is in 2 weeks good for you? Do you want to take more time? What do you want to communicate to the cardiologist? Making sure that insurance denials are dealt with appropriately and that's not put on the patient. Taking on the work of the long-term disability claims process and compiling that information for you and working with you to actually appeal whatever denial you have gotten. Making sure that you are getting the proper accommodations at work and at school. So, and doing a lot of the paperwork that doctors often say they won't do because they literally don't have time because they're pressured by the medical business model in a way that does not allow them to pause and strategize and take time to really do things for patients well. And we're really trying to take labor off of the patient as much as possible, but the care managers will also be taking labor off of the clinicians because we see another really big problem we see in medicine amongst all the problems that exist at every level is clinicians are burned out and they're leaving en masse and they disappear randomly and then patients don't have people to help them. And we really want to address a lot of the labor issues that clinicians are facing as well in terms of being overworked, in terms of not being given the kind of staff support or help to be able to manage the patient load that you have, and things like that. So we're trying to, create a system where people know what their roles are and they take on those roles responsibly, and they communicate with each other. They'll have time in their days to have meetings with each other. We're building in time for consistent education so that they're always learning. And making sure everyone's access needs are met too, and really teaching that whole process and ethos within medicine, which is totally not there. So, when we open, not everyone we hire is going to be perfect. So it'll definitely be an ongoing process, but we think we've developed enough of a system to where, these are the conversations we'll be having and they will be very consistent conversations and we will be making sure that folks feel supported in being able to, have difficult conversations with patients and not take things personally. We see that all the time where clinicians take frustration and anger that a patient is expressing as personally. And even if they screwed up, they should just acknowledge they screwed up and, not take it as, what I'm saying. They just take it too personally. So there's definitely some resources we're going to be giving folks, clinicians in particular, to understand how to have conversations with people in a way that is constructive and not self-centered.
I think that concept of people being bridges like that's a beautiful thing right there. I think super needed. Super, super nice. Yeah. Because it is too much. It's too much. And I think it's also too much for the clinicians to keep their awareness where a patient would be, like sometimes the clinicians, they've just seen it. They've seen all these things and they're just like, bam, 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 this is what's going on. And the patients got no idea what they're talking about, and there's just, I see that miss happen a lot. And so I think what you're talking about is really awesome.
Yeah. So Fingers crossed, you know?
Yeah. Thanks, Uriel, and thanks, Audrey. And Audrey, do you want to answer Amy's question next, and then I'll go to Margaret's since it's about the clinic. Amy asked, are you considering offering virtual care to folks in other states eventually?
Yes. So we're also planning on going into other states. We want to do New York, and then we want to do a really unregulated state that has, you know, no abortion services and really bad social services. So we want that kind of the opposites of the so-called spectrum of healthcare regulation at the state and federal level. Um, but we actually, so the way we can do virtual care, we're going to be trying to do as much virtual as possible. I think policy is going to be changing our regulations pretty constantly, and we're going to need to be pretty constantly navigating that. We will definitely have full virtual care options for people who are paying fully out of pocket on a sliding scale rate. If you have Medicaid or Medicare, you often cannot cross state lines and get coverage. So that is a general problem that exists. However, if you have commercial insurance, usually the policy is you do one in-person visit a year, and then you can do telehealth for the rest of the year. And same with Medicaid and Medicare of the state that you're in. So ideally, we're only asking folks to come in one time to check that box, and then they're doing virtual appointments as much as they need to. So if you're out of state, that would mean you'd only come in state one time a year to check that box. There was also a policy that just changed, and I wish Gray was here, that makes it easier for us to take insurance across state lines and do virtual care and maybe even do an initial virtual care visit. But I can't remember exactly what it is, so I can't say it right now. But we're very on top of all of the policy changes from the Center for Medicaid and Medicare and how that dictates everything. I mean, that's really one of our main focuses is medical coding and the administrative side. So we will be very communicative about what those options are across state lines and be, you know, making sure that we're offering that. And Amy says, thank you. I look forward to seeing how all of this unfolds. Yeah, the unfolding will be an interesting experience. It's going to be pretty wild.
Yeah,
It'll be
cool.
good. Yeah.
I'm gonna bop back up. Oh no, I'm gonna read Molly's comment first. Molly says, it's so very encouraging to hear the way you have reimagined care. Thank you times 1,000. Thank you, Molly.
I'm gonna try.
And yeah, we do as much as we can, and y'all support enables us to do that. So thank you. And I'm going to bop back up to Margaret's question. Margaret says, I know you said you don't focus on hypermobility anymore, but I was curious what you have to say about diagnosis for older people. The old criteria of hypermobile joints clearly don't work well in older populations with comorbidities like, for example, arthritis. This is a great question. And the first thing I'll say is that we certainly still include hypermobility. It is one of the hyper presentations of hype, but because it's been the sole aesthetic focus of medical history and medical diagnostics, it has left out so many people, which is why we've pivoted away from it as kind of a central term to make sure that we're including the whole constellation of connective tissue variants, whether it looks like bendy joints or it doesn't. And this is actually a perfect example of why that focus on hypermobility can be so detrimental. The current criteria for diagnosis of connective tissue variants that is understood as being at least related to connective tissue, whereas there are a lot of other diagnoses where they're not really thinking about connective tissue and the mechanism. The criteria for that connective tissue specific diagnosis really, really relies on hypermobility and a narrow measurement of hypermobility at that, where they're looking at very specific joints in very specific directions and leaving out anyone who doesn't meet that criteria. And when it comes to folks, whether it's because they're older, whether it's because they developed certain inflammatory things earlier on in life, whether it's because the literal shape of their bones means that their joints don't present in the way that the criteria expects, gets them left out of diagnostics. This is a really big neglect problem. And it's also something that, to a certain extent, can be navigated by patients if they're equipped with the right information when they enter the diagnostic process, because there actually is a portion of the current most used criteria that asks if someone has ever been able to do those hypermobile joint manipulations they have you do. And we're always kind of telling folks to say yes to that, even if maybe they don't remember from their youth, because that's one of the only ways that they can gather enough points to be diagnosed with that criteria. So there is a certain allowance for joints that are no longer hypermobile or never were hypermobile to still kind of get included in that criteria. But that's not the way that doctors think. And that's not the way that the criteria was really designed in terms of inclusivity. Anything you want to add on that, Audrey?
I mean, something we've definitely also seen come into play for folks who are seeking diagnosis later in life is the concept of, well, if this was really a problem, why weren't you diagnosed earlier? Why didn't you actually do anything about it? Or, you know, this can't actually be that bad for you because you've made it this far, which is totally so dismissive and horrible. And so I think because of that, unfortunately, folks might have to take a really aggressive position and kind of lay into the provider communicating these were always problems, these that, just not playing up the severity, but being more honest and direct about it. I think we're really conditioned to normalize all of those experiences. And so thinking as if you're a person who had a normal body yesterday and now is entering your body, what would that kind of discrepancy severity really be like? Because having chronic pain and chronic problems for so long, it's hard to be like, well, what is my baseline? And was it ever really good? And did I ever feel different? And I think clinicians try and take advantage of that. And then also use like, oh, you just have RA, or you just have this thing instead of that thing, instead of connecting the dots. So then having to connect the dots for them, which sometimes offends them and sometimes they'll listen.
Yeah, a couple things to add in response to that. One is, it should not be the patient's responsibility. So much responsibility is put on us, and that's a big part of our model and what we're trying to lift off of the patients. And I also want to add kind of an addendum for when it comes to advocating directly to physicians. How safe that is really depends based on identities people have. And sometimes if someone tries to advocate or argue with a clinician and say they are a Black person or a fat person or a visibly trans person, that can sometimes end up being detrimental to their care. But it's very case by case, and that's just something I want to bring up because keeping folks safe is really important. And there are different ways to go about advocacy. And what else was I going to say? I lost it. But oh yeah, I found it.
Well, thank you both. That was very helpful information.
Oh, great. Thanks,
I'll
Margaret.
mute myself again. I just wanted to be able to say thank you because it provided a couple things I didn't know. So it was
Great.
a useful response. Thanks. Thanks again.
Thank you. And I thought of the thing I wanted to add, which is by the time folks have gone undiagnosed and untreated that long, the people to blame are those physicians and the medical system itself, not that person, which is really how it comes off. And if you've been gaslighted, if you've been mistreated in medical situations to, eventually start believing yourself that your symptoms are less severe than they are, I think that also poses huge challenges to advocacy that we also want to come in and help people navigate, because how can someone advocate for themselves when they've been taught that their experience isn't real? So a lot of dimensions to that. And thanks for the question. Yeah, and it is almost 8:15. I think we maybe had a couple questions gathered from community we could answer, but a lot of them have been touched on. Does anyone who's here live right now have more questions for us? We were going to take a break if we were going to keep going, but I think maybe a couple more and we wrap up. Yeah, anything coming up for anyone?
It's a great one. Atta, I may not be saying your name correctly, so I apologize. Says in the chat, oh, it's right. Yes. Okay, great. Atta, cool. Any advice on if you failed a tilt table, but you believe you still have POTS? Okay, so my first question is, how long did they have you upright? Was it 5 minutes? Was it 10 minutes? Was it 20 minutes? Because different people do different things. And sometimes the software that they purchase that comes with their tilt table measuring devices limit the methods that they can choose from and that the system will collect data for and interpret. So to me, anything 10 minutes and below, trash. Like, no. We need to be looking at times that are longer. And at the same time, that doesn't mean on a tilt table you're going to catch anything. So this idea that tilt tables are able to identify POTS effectively, no. They can also be really harmful to people and cause really significant flares. So I think, if you're thinking of a tilt table and you don't really want to do it and you feel like maybe it's going to hurt you, like maybe try and advocate to not do the tilt table, because that does happen. Okay, and Atta's saying, I think it was 5 minutes, maybe 10, not more than 10. Yeah, and it's probably a limitation based on the device that they purchased to assess it. And this is something that we're in conversation with our manufacturer about, because the 10 minutes as the maximum is not enough time. We want at least like 15, 20, play around with it. Like this isn't a catch-all diagnostic test. Somebody could be having a better day. Somebody could be feeling adrenaline rushes from their PTSD being triggered for being in a medical facility. There's so many reasons that your body may not behave the same way that it would on the street or whatever. And you can, like, the symptoms in medical coding that allow to get POTS care approved is chronic dehydration and orthostatic hypotension and chronic orthostatic hypotension. So you don't need a POTS diagnosis in your medical records for an insurance company to approve POTS care. And a lot of times our clinical lead who we work with, that's how she approaches things. If she doesn't think a tilt table is safe enough for someone, she's not going to send them to that and she's going to put in their chart these symptom sets, which we know are happening, that give you access to the exact same care. The other thing is having a wearable, which you have to be able to afford a wearable, which is something, and not all wearables are made the same. And when I mean a wearable, I mean like a tracking device that tracks your heart rate. And just catching moments when it goes, 20 or 30 beats above from wherever you were before. Or if you have a heart rate that is consistently, I'm laying down and it is 90 something and it is not going down, or it's super low and positional changes aren't changing it either. Those moments that you catch yourself often are meeting the criteria that they're looking for on a tilt table. That's what they're looking for. So if you can produce that, one would hope that they would, approve it. Amy put something in the chat. I was talking to my physical therapist today about the tilt table test, and she also pointed out that this test has a high false negative rate. Exactly. And that it's really just a snapshot of that specific day. So it's not good info on the person's patterns and fluctuations and overall experience. Exactly. And, when you go from one position to another, you're not normally like strapped onto a platform that like raises or like changes orientation. So you're not also activating your musculature in the same way. If you do have POTS that is triggered by spinal instability, sometimes it might not trigger in the same way, and things like that. So tilt table is not end all be all. And River put in the chat, I have to go. This was very informative. Thank you so much. Thank you, River, for attending. So yeah, don't do a tilt table again if you don't have to. And track your own shit and be like, look, here it is, which I know is really annoying. But also the symptom set, orthostatic hypotension, chronic orthostatic hypotension, and chronic dehydration. Some of those codes are literally the codes that are used for a POTS diagnosis anyway. So it's not like they need to go that far.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Were you going to read what was in the chat?
Oh, no, I was going to add something. I hadn't seen that yet. So go ahead and read it.
Oh, okay. Atta says, thank you. So seek out care for the symptoms and get a tracker. Yes, that would be the way. And then go back and be like, it's still bad. It's getting worse. Here's the data. False negative rate, and hope that that works. What were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to add part of what you said about seeking out care for the symptoms. This goes back to, I think, something we actually discussed in our last teach-in of not necessarily focusing on getting the, in quotes, correct diagnosis, but focusing on what you strategically need to do to get the care that you need. So for example, I've never had a tilt table test. I have a generalized dysautonomia diagnosis that enables me to get the care I need for my symptoms. But because my doctor knew that I couldn't tolerate that, and I knew I couldn't tolerate that, we didn't go through that whole thing, but I was still able to access those symptoms. And POTS has become such a kind of ubiquitous diagnosis that's going around all these different, what we consider connective tissue variant communities right now. And it can be incredibly validating for people to receive. And mechanistically, it is a pretty good description of what's going on for a lot of people. But sometimes it's a lot more important to get that care however you can than to get the diagnosis that you're hoping to receive.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like all of this POTS discussion really connects to that point about like having to present information in a digestible way when in reality these experiences are like super duper variable and don't actually even get categorized appropriately and frequently enough in the patient population. This is really one of the main problems is like the approach that, oh, well, let's just use the scientific method to figure out like the mechanism and how it works and how you treat it. And it's so much more like That's, you know, it's not this like one track linear thing. And more people than not are examples of the variability rather than fitting that perfect image of what POTS is supposed to look like or be. And if you've been getting dizzy and almost blacking out for your whole life, maybe you don't even realize you're doing that and you think it's really normal. You're like, oh, I didn't know I'm not supposed to lose my vision when I stand up. You know, that can take years to identify when you're really used to it. So the descriptors that people come to the doctor with might also not even be the descriptors they're looking for because things are so normalized that it's really difficult to cognitively even identify and name. Because if your vision just goes out every time you stand up, why would you notice that? You know, like, anyway, I wish they asked questions instead of assumed answers, but
Here we are in the medical industrial complex. Yeah. All right. Any final questions or thoughts from folks before we wrap up? And for the folks attending asynchronously, checking this out through YouTube, you can leave questions in the comments. We'll check them out and we'll find ways to incorporate them into our content. Margaret says, thank you very much. Another thank you from Atta. Sophia says, thank you so much. Excited for the clinic and appreciative of all the work you are doing. Thank you.
thank you all. We appreciate the support. We hope that you have a great weekend. Yeah.
We do. Thanks so much for coming. Please support the Million Match campaign in any ways you can. Share our content online. It really makes a difference. All right. Gonna wrap up. I'm gonna stop the recording. Good evening to you all.